Strange Shadows, a Ashton Smith podcast.
Cliff Howard's first sensation as he came back to consciousness was one of well-nigh insufferable heat. It seemed to beat upon him from all sides in a furnace-like blast, and to lie upon his face, limbs and body with the heaviness of molten metal. Then, before he had opened his eyes, he became aware of the furious light that smote upon his lids, turning them to a flame-red curtain. His eyeballs ached with the muffled radiation. Every nerve of his being cringed from the pouring sea of incandescence, and there was a dull throbbing in his scalp, which might have been either headache induced by the heat, or the pain of a somewhat recent blow. He recalled, very dimly, that there had been an expedition somewhere in which he had taken part, but his efforts to remember the details were momentarily distracted by new and inexplicable sensations. He felt now that he was moving swiftly, borne on something that pitched and bounded against a high wind that seared his face like the breath of hell.
Greetings, friends, and thank you for joining us on Strange Shadows today for Season 3, Episode 14 of our Clark Ashton Smith podcast, where we're covering the weird fiction of Clark Ashton Smith in chronological order, using the Nightshade books as our guide. The voice you just heard was Shelley De Cruz reading the opening of today's story, The Immortals of Mercury. I'm one of your hosts, Rob Poynton.
And I'm the other one, Tim Mendes. Yes, we're back in full-on science fiction territory today, aren't we?
Yes.
This is the second in a row of these sort of stories. But today is slightly different because we're going to be joined by an esteemed guest all the way from the other side of the pond. We're going to be joined by Mr. David D Perlmutter. David, how are you doing?
Hello, sirs. Very glad to be here.
Good to have you, sir. Good to have you. And perhaps before we start, you could tell us a little bit about yourself, and in particular, how you got into weird fiction and the works of Mr. Smith.
Thank you. Well, my name is David D Perlmutter, and I am a professor at Texas Tech University, which is in West Texas, which I think is about as far away from England as you can go, without diving deep into the earth and trying to find Hyperborea or something. But I've been here for 11 years now. I was an administrator, but now I'm teaching and doing my research. And I've been doing work on political communication and visual communication within being a journalism professor for about 33 years. And I'm always just fascinated by the persuasive power of writing and pictures. And that sort of sums up some of the things I've done. I wrote a book on the history of the visualization of warfare. And I wrote a book about photojournalism and foreign policy. But within that, I teach classes, introductory classes, I teach writing classes. And I just love to discover people who are expressing themselves in brilliant ways, whether it's visually or through the written or through the spoken word. And I do not remember the first time that I came across Clark Ashton Smith. I actually, when I was growing up, I was more of a historical hobbyist. I played those large hex war games like Battle of Stalingrad or Campaign for North Africa. If anybody,
I was just about to say that. Yeah.
Yes.
If anybody's up for a game after this, we can do that.
You've got to have a spare week. Yeah.
Yeah. Campaign for North Africa being the most famous hex game it was actually referenced in the American TV series The Big Bang Theory, where somebody was holding a copy of the game and said, well, we've got a couple hours this weekend. And of course, that game is famous for taking longer to play than the actual war.
Yes.
So anyway, I'm always was interested in just sort of historical details. And because at that time, there were two gangs of nerd geeks. There was the fantasy gang that played Dungeons and Dragons and was really into elves and orcs and things. And then there were the historical folks like me, and we looked down upon the fantasy people. They were you have to have an enemy in life, and so we picked our enemy to be the Tolkien people, the Cthulhu people. And later, though, when I matured slightly, I started reading some of this stuff, and I fell in love with Tolkien. Of course, I thought just astonishing accomplishment. And then I started reading Lovecraft, Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, August Derleth, and then just down the list that you're much more familiar with. But I really came away not thinking, I try not to say like one writer is better than another, because I think it's sort of, what are you looking for and what are you trying to get out of it, right? And what's the point of the writing?
Yeah.
Some people can be an excellent writer within a particular genre, and someone are excellent in another genre. But anyway, I came away that I was most impressed by the prose craft of Clark Ashton Smith. I just sit there and I'm rereading. I bought the Nightshade editions that you're talking about a year and a half ago, read them through. I had never read Clark Ashton Smith in the original Clark Ashton Smith, because I did not realize, I was not a scholar of this like you, that he had been so heavily edited.
Yeah.
As somebody who's written a lot, I'm very grateful for some editing. I'm bitterly resentful for other editing, like all authors, and I'm very lucky now. That's an interesting debate, which I'd like to have at some point, because you've brought up the editing, and there are some authors, famously Robert Heinlein, who got to be very powerful and then basically said, you're not going to edit me anymore. And I think that hurt his writing of not being edited.
I think Stephen King's another one. When you look at like the unedited version of The Stand, there's so much fluff. You can see why it was cut out.
Yeah. The Godfather is a great example. The editing that was done by Francis Ford Coppola to make the movie, people see the movie and they go, wow, this is astonishing. And then they read the book and they go, okay. I mean, there's some good stuff there, but wow, it's, purple prose and details about anatomical body parts and so on. Anyway, editing, it's not always, brilliant author crushed by unknowing, ignorant editor. Sometimes a good editor can be wonderful. I say this, by the way, my wife is a editor for a book press, and she's the best in the entire world, as you will plug later, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So my point was that I just fell in love with Clark Ashton Smith's writing. I think somebody can come in and say the plot was a little stretched, incredulity sometimes, or maybe a story didn't have a plot, but that's okay with me, because he's one of those people. I'm old enough to remember Sean Connery. You may know him. He was one of yours, right? And
Splendid.
There was some phrase somebody said that Sean Connery was in a not so good film, but like you could just stand there and listen to Sean Connery read the phone book, and it would be amazing, fascinating, and transfixing. And I think that's true of Clark Ashton Smith. Clark Ashton Smith could have written directions on how to get to Los Angeles from his small town, and I would reread them, for their glorious prose. So,
to be fair, that is like a lot of his letters. He's just talking about day-to-day life, but it's fascinating because of the way he's written it. Because, it's the same with Lovecraft, actually, as well. Have
you read his emails and his text messages? They're just as brilliant. Absolutely. Yeah. This is a question, again, I'd love to get into if you ever have me back, which I don't think you will after this opening, is that you wonder about these people if they lived in a different time. I mean, people were men or women of letters. And we've sort of forgotten what that means, right? Is that I have not, my next project is to get as many of the collected letters as I can. I know in your first podcast, you talked about getting recommendations, and I've picked up your recommendations. So I have not read the letters. I've only read the Nightshade version and some other things I've found. But that is really fascinating to me, because of course now we live in an age where we're producing more content. I mean, both of you have probably in your average month write more than all of Shakespeare's combined works in terms of email or text messages or notes or something like that. The average person does. And I'm sure your stuff will be immortal, in terms of like thousands of years from now. People will read your text messages and go, my God, these people lived. But what would these people be in this kind of an era?
Yeah, I'm saying we can look back on the letters of Lovecraft or Dickens or Poe or whoever to some extent. In the future, everything that's being produced today digitally will probably be lost.
Yes.
It's so ephemeral, isn't it? All this communication, like, because we were talking about this before about like the pandemic. Could you imagine like the circle on a Zoom call? Like Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard and Bobby Block and August Derleth all on a Zoom call going, oh, it's a nightmare, isn't it?
Mask? I wear no mask.
Yeah, but boy, that would be amazing for that to have been preserved. In fact, that would be a great reenactment for a convention, right?
That's not a bad idea. Yeah.
You got us thinking again.
So anyway, I fell in love with his craft of writing, and I what I do whenever I read anything of his is I'll just pick out some phrases, and then as you have mentioned on the podcast, you should have the Oxford Unabridged English Dictionary next to you, because often he's using words which I think may never have been used by anyone. I mean, they're in the Oxford Dictionary, so somebody must have used them once.
Yeah.
As far as I can tell, he's never credited as the originator of a particular word, although I think he's credited for some terms. Like, I'm just going to say one now, and we'll go into whatever you want to talk about. But I'm reading now from the Immortals of Mercury. He was bound Mazeppa-like to the back of one of those salamandrine monsters to which the earth scientists had given the name of heat lizards. Well, first of all, I have never used salamandrine in an email before. And then Mazeppa. Now, I actually had heard of Mazeppa because I'm doing some work on the Ukraine war. And Mazeppa is a famous Ukrainian patriot who was written up in the famous poem. And Mazeppa was punished by the king of Poland for falling in love with his daughter. And Mazeppa was tied to a horse, a white horse, like this character, Cliff Howard, is tied to one of these creatures that wanders into the sun heat area of Mercury. So I just how do you know that?
I know. I mean, because again, as we say in those days, he wasn't looking it up on Google, was he? It was like whatever was in the Auburn Library, which from several accounts he just drained. I almost imagine him starting at the end of one shelf and going through.
This is a small town in California. They had this? Yeah. This is really amazing.
Yeah, I guess they must have had books of folklore and books of myth and history and encyclopedias, all that kind of stuff, I guess.
Yeah.
But then to retain that knowledge as well,
Well, I think it's safe to say he had an eidetic memory, didn't he? Because he famously memorized the dictionary. He sat and learned it as I would learn a script or a song or something like that. The bloody dictionary. I mean, how you would go about doing that, I have no idea. But yeah, it's impressive, isn't it? It comes out in that sort of poetic background as well. So I think a lot of these sort of archaic terms come from that sort of poetry grounding, I think.
Yeah, it's archaic without being. I mean, the temptation, if you say archaic, is to go into sort of some sort of cod medieval or
foldy-roldy radio day. Yeah. Yeah, foldy-roldy radio.
Yeah. Hey nonny Shakespearean thing, right? But he manages to avoid that. I mean, that's something that Tolkien uses. Well, there's a whole other subject. Tolkien uses to some extent, of course, a man with a very in-depth knowledge of languages. But yeah, they're words I've never ever heard before quite often. And words that you sort of think sometimes, did he make that up? But then you research them. I mean, well, there's one example here, libration.
Yeah.
And I thought, does he mean libation, a drink?
No.
But no, a libration is an apparent oscillation of the moon. I mean,
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
does that come from?
It's the variations on words that gets me sometimes, because my writer brain kicks in and goes, "Is that a typo?" Like today there was rugate. I'm so used to seeing rugose when talking about the sort of wrinkled, like a worm, but no, rugate. It's basically the same thing. It's just a different. It's just a different variation on it,
Yeah.
and it threw me for a second. I was like, "Is that a typo?" Nope. It's just a version of that word I've not seen before. I like it. Yeah.
Well, yes. And the other thing I would say is when I'm teaching writing, I urge students not to use a strange or unfamiliar word just for effect or to impress people, right? In fact, George Orwell has a great essay on politics in the English language. It's probably one of his most famous essays. And he talks about don't use these complicated Norman French words when an Anglo-Saxon word will do. And so Clark Ashton Smith may have been the person he was talking about, but all of the words are correct and appropriate. That you don't feel that he was going like, oh, I really want to shock the readers, or I want to impress the readers with how smart I am. I'll just stick in a word that I heard years ago or found in the dictionary. I think they actually mean what they say, and they're correct for the usage at the moment.
Yeah,
but they're very decorative as well. There's another phrase in here, noctilucent fungi.
Nice. Yeah.
Which is at once accurate in its description, but atmospheric as well.
Yeah.
You can see that this thing that glows in the dark has its own phosphorescence.
Yeah. I have a couple of more, and I'm not going to read them all, but I thought just some earlier impressions, and you know much more than this about me. Obviously, the protagonist in this story, I thought it was interesting. His name is Cliff Howard, and obviously, I don't know how much correspondence there was between Ashton Smith and Robert Howard, right? They're all in the circle there. They're all in the Zoom call together, right?
Yeah.
But I did notice that this protagonist, probably more than a lot of Smith's protagonists, solves all his problems by being a two-fisted tough guy.
Yeah.
Yes. I picked up on that. I did wonder if the name Howard was a nod to Two Gun Bob.
Yeah.
Because if it was a Howard and he was more of a scholar, you'd think Lovecraft, right?
Yes.
But no, this is a Howard who likes to punch people on the nose. You'd think it's
an action man, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the cliff is kind of a bit foreshadowing of the ending, right? As well.
That's true.
So,
Yeah, I felt that this was there's a genre that doesn't exist anymore, which the British excelled in, called the two-fisted tale of the sea. Typically about a young boy who goes before the mast and grows up to be a captain and gets in lots of fights. And this felt like almost like a two-fisted tale. There obviously there was a science fiction element. I think you very much described it as sort of science fiction-y. Was it there science-y, fiction-y?
Science fiction was the term they used.
Science fiction, yeah. I mean, it could have been. He refers to Hyperborean hell later in the story. So this could have been a Hyperborea story where just an explorer wandered into a hellscape, and there was these immortal beings who have their own interesting world there, but it is set in a science fiction setting, I guess. Yeah, I think you've discussed this before about. It's not a negative criticism of Clark Ashton Smith to say his science fiction was really low on science, but that's fine. He wanted to set up a story and then he told a story.
Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah.
And I think from the editorial perspective, the main thing they wanted from a science fiction story was action in any case, really. Yeah. They were Westerns set in space or chaps in tweed exploring in space kind of thing, rather than they didn't want them throwing up scientific concepts, particularly to make the readers think. I don't think that's what Gernsback and people like that were after.
No, which is actually something that, because one of the things I do is I look in the letters to see if there's any correspondence about these stories in forthcoming issues, right? And a lot of the time you get this argument between readers. You'll get the one guy going, why does none of the science fiction have real science in it? Blah, 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 blah. And then everybody else will be going, because it'd be really boring. We want action. We want fist fights. We want buxom ladies with laser guns kind of thing, right? So yeah, I guess that these editors are kind of catering to that market.
To a market, yeah. So speaking of that then, Tim, what's the publication history on this one? Was this sent to Weird Tales at all? Or?
Well, we'll get there. But not initially, because like The Invisible City before it, Smith wrote this specifically with Astounding Stories in mind. Because if you recall last time, we discussed that he'd been approached by the editor and asked why he'd never subbed to them. And it turns out Smith wasn't a fan of the publication. He just really wasn't a fan of it. But he was a fan of the fact that they paid 2 cents per word, which would make it a very, very lucrative story if it was to get published. He started writing it in mid-December 1931. It took around a month, which is a lot longer than normal for Smith, but this was due to his mother falling ill with an infected heel. He wrote about this in a letter to August Derleth. And again, like The Invisible City, Smith wasn't a fan of this story. Interestingly, he called it a hunk of tripe, which is verbatim what he said about The Invisible City.
Wow.
I when I first found the letter to Derleth, I thought, have I got the same one as last time?
Right.
No, it's a different letter. It's a different letter about a different story, but in his head, it was a hunk of tripe.
Yeah.
But he did also say that if they took it, it'll be worth it because he would be paid $200 for it.
A not inconsiderable amount for that time, I imagine.
Exactly. So you can see why he tried twice to get in.
Yeah.
Yeah. Could I interject here a moment? This is something we talk about a lot in classes which explore creativity, because as you might imagine, students in our major, many of them, or almost all of them, want to be creatives of some kind. Now, it could be creatives in working in the advertising industry, or it could be creatives making films, and television shows, and games, so on nowadays. And I think we've all had absorbed over the years a mythology of the artist who, like Horace said, art for art's sake. But in history, there are very, very few artists who were independently wealthy and could just create their art and only consider what they wanted. Most artists, like Smith, had to create what fit a market. And this goes back a long way. I remember a long time ago taking some courses in art history that affected me. I almost became an art history major because I was so interested in this. But there's a famous book by a scholar named Michael Baxendale called Painting and Experience in 14th century, in the Italy of Michelangelo Leonardo. And he actually, what you did, like going back to the letters, he did. And he found that most of these great artists were were creating their art, their sculpture, their painting on contracts.
Oh, absolutely.
They weren't just doing the Sistine Chapel or David, because it inspired them, but like somebody contracted them, and the contracts were often incredibly detailed.
Yeah, well, they're working to order, weren't they? A lot of time. Yeah. Yeah.
So they'd say use this much gold paint. Something you think the artist is making an independent decision, right? But like the merchant who wants his wife painted likes gold and his wife likes blue. So, Leonardo, when you paint this thing, make sure you put a lot of blue and glue. And we don't think of artists being influenced in that way.
Yeah.
And maybe it was less so than Farnsworth hacking away at Smith. But it is always important to know that everybody writes for a market somewhere. Everybody is edited somewhere. Again, you can reach the peak of, I don't know whether George R. R. Martin, I know he has an editor, but I don't know how much influence Brandon Sanderson, very popular fantasy author, he's not my cup of tea, but I really respect him. I also respect him because he's apparently such a good person, very, very friendly to fans and things like that. But I saw a TikTok video from him, and he said he just finished an edition of one of his books, a new book, and he'd sent it off to his editorial team.
An editorial team. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, some of them do. Yeah.
Yeah. So apparently he doesn't mind being edited.
But I mean, even a genius like Mozart, right? Whether it's apocryphal or not, we get the too many notes kind of situation.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Beethoven, all of them, they were all right into order, because that's the only way you could survive, I guess, in those times. Well, and today it's no different today, all right?
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. Right. Well, yes. Unfortunately, they rejected it. So after all that, it was rejected for the same reasons as the previous story, that it didn't have enough action and it lacked human interest, which unfortunately the letters don't still exist. So I can't delve any deeper into that, into what they mean by human interest, but I guess they mean characterization. I guess that's what they mean, because he is kind of a cipher character, isn't he? Just sort of, he's in this situation, he walks through the situation, blah, 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 blah. I don't think he has any dialogue, does he?
That's no different from many other Smith characters or Lovecraft. That's how these guys wrote, right? So,
yeah.
I have a question for both of you on that, because it did strike me that, okay, here's Cliff Howard, and he's a plant botanist, and he's on Mercury, and he has this adventure. And when these rejections occurred, I mean, give me half an hour and I can stick in a couple of paragraphs about, I don't know, his father died, and his father was a great plant botanist who always wanted to travel into space, and he never got to. But his son, I mean, anybody nowadays can stick in some characterization. Did Smith just refuse to do it, or did he not know how to do it, or did he not want to do it? Why couldn't the editor in these situations have said, hey, just stick in a couple of paragraphs of characterization?
Well, the thing is, it depends, because that kind of market is a quick turnover. Because I've had it before, when I've had something rejected. Oh, this, and this, but that's it, because they've got an open submission window. Once that's closed, it's closed. Other editors, which we've seen in the past with Smith stories, will say, "Can you do a bit more like this, and this?" And that's when you tend to find the stories get a lot of the Baroque language stripped out of it because of the revisions. Now, Smith did revise this story. In a letter to August Derleth, dated February the 21st, 1932, he wrote, "I haven't done anything new since I have a lot of revision on my hands. I've given the Mercury yarn a grim and terrific ending, so there may be a chance for it with Wright. If not, Gernsback ought to like it." Now, he was quite prophetic in this. Unfortunately, Wright did reject it, which is kind of standard for Farnsworth Wright.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. But David Lasser, who was Gernsback editor, did accept it on behalf of Hugo the Rat. But not for Wonder Stories, as he was intending. Instead, it was printed as a separate standalone pamphlet. Yeah, right. It was a standalone pamphlet. There was a series of them that the Gernsback outfit put out. And I think it was number 16 in the sort of series of standalone science fiction stories.
So kind of like a sort of special edition kind of thing.
Yeah.
I've seen that for sale. When I was looking this up on the internet, you can buy a copy of the pamphlet.
Yeah,
there.
I think I saw it on A Books or something. Because I was looking for the cover of it, because by all accounts it was pretty sort of nondescript without a proper cover.
It's just typescript. There's just no giant Mercutian, trying to kill this two-fisted alien human. Sorry.
No no brundage or anything like that.
No, yeah, I sent you it, Rob, so you can see it in all its splendor. It's
Yeah, I saw. Yeah, yeah. I'll put it up as the picture for the episode so people can see it. Yeah.
So part of this was the problem that they didn't have the internet, they didn't have texting, they didn't have email. So Smith writes a story, and I think it's described in Nightshade Books, but you also described in your podcast earlier that like he'll make several copies, TypeScript, right?
Yeah.
Writing, handwriting, penning, and TypeScript, and he's sending a copy to an editor, and so that's a couple of weeks, probably.
This
right?
is it. This is it, right?
Yeah. And then for an editor to say, could you change something, is a couple of weeks.
That's another 2 weeks back. Then the editor.
So the editor is thinking, is this easily changeable, or can I change it myself?
Or should we just say no? And yeah.
Or do I just say, sorry, rejected, on to the next one in the pile?
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. Because you've got to remember, because I mean, I've done slush reading for a publisher. You get so much stuff. Like you're wading through literal, but this is digital I'm talking about now. And it's hard work enough. But you can imagine the stack of these manuscripts on your desk. It must have been incredibly hard work for these editors to get through all the submissions for the next issue or the issue down the line, because they're probably going to be working like 2 or 3 issues in hand. So yeah, I imagine it is just a case of nope. Oh yeah, we'll take that one. Nope. You know, it's I mean, that's just the thing with it, with the pulps, I guess, because it's by its nature, you know, it's throwaway fiction.
And I can't imagine anyone involved at the time would have thought that, well, 100 years later, people will be doing podcasts about this literature. You know, we should be talking about Steinbeck and people like this, and not these, air quote, inferior authors. Yeah, it's strange.
Well, exactly. Yeah, this is it. In any case, he was paid $80 for it, which is a bit of a step down from the 200 he was hoping for. But 80 quid is still not bad for them days, right? Still not bad at all.
Mm.
And yes, I was right. It was listed as Science Fiction Series number 16 for those that want to track it down. There you go.
Okay, so let's get into the story then. And I have to say, the first thing I've written down here after reading and hearing that opening paragraph with throbbing in the scalp, eyeballs aching and everything else was, we've all had hangovers like that, haven't we?
Indeed. Well, I couldn't help it. Like, I think it's on the first page. The first thing I spotted, it was almost like my eyes were drawn to it. You know, when you look at a page of writing and your eyes drift off from the top line. First thing I spotted was Twilight Zone.
Yes.
Which crops up like 2 or 3 times in this story, right? So all the way through it, I've had the going through my head.
You do wonder, like we mentioned Star Trek a lot, I wonder if the Twilight Zone name was from this, or is it a common saying?
Well, I have a question about that. I am fascinated when I see something in older science fiction or older fantasy, and now it's become a common trope, right? But back then may have been relatively innovative. When I was reading this, I was thinking about some parallels to the Alien franchise, because here's this plant botanist and he's in an alien planet and he's poking his around. He thinks there's nothing dangerous there. And I was thinking, boy, that's John Hurt in the first Alien movie. Like, here's this giant alien pod and it's opening. I wonder what's in here. I'll just stick my face in there and, let's see what happens. And complications ensue.
Mm.
And then when the Immortals of Mercury come later, I was thinking, God, the way they're described as sort of giant alabaster statue-like, Greek. I mean, we all know that Greek statues were once painted, but like the ones we see now are obviously what's associated with Greek statues are the white look of them, the musculature. Well, I thought of the engineers from Aliens.
Yes, very true.
So like there's two concepts there in this story which I saw direct parallel to the Alien franchise.
Yeah. Yes. Very good. And I do think Star Trek pops up again as well, as it so often does for me in these science fiction stories with the
and 60s Doctor Who.
Yeah, I can almost visualize when we get into the vast cavern later as one of those original series painted backdrop sets, with that weird atmospheric noise and the booming voice of the aliens.
I was going to say, I got that, that reverb effect. That attention, people of Earth, that with all the reverb and a little bit of delay on it, right? I was hearing the dialogue from the Immortals in that thing voice again, and there was a little theremin behind it as well, a little.
You can't go wrong with the theremin.
Yeah, I want one.
Well, when you are writing, this is a question to you because you're prolific actual writers, and of course you're much more familiar with the fiction thing. I've always thought it's very difficult, and as far as I know, in my opinion, Tolkien was one of the only people to pull this off, to have people speak in English. It's another language, and you're hearing English, but they speak in a pattern and a tone and a sort of staccato that make you feel that they're not two California guys having a discussion at a bar, right? So it's very hard to write formal language that doesn't sound stiff, or using casual language that just sounds weird in the mouths of fantasy creatures or people in the future. Isaac Asimov was a great writer, but he had no problem having people on other planets, alien species, say, "Hey, you dirty rats." That was okay for him to do that. Yeah. He felt it was okay. And in this story, I was a little surprised, like these immortal Mercutians say, well, as you say, done to a turn. And I thought, would the immortal Mercutians really bother to say, as you say? I mean, first of all, they don't care what anybody else says, right? And second, would they use that expression? I thought maybe that was the hand of an editor.
That's very possible, because again, looking at the demographic or the market for the magazine, Smith got into enough trouble as it was for his highfalutin words, so they're probably looking for a degree of a sort of common language, if I could put it like that, for the dialogue. But it is something that can be incredibly jarring. Again, we've got that, as we said before, that sort of cod medievalism. But at the same time, if you've got the orcs rock up and go, "Hey, you guys, we're going to catch a show later and you want to hang out with us?" No, it doesn't really work, does it?
One of the most egregious examples of this in recent memory for me was that I say recent, I think it was a couple of years ago now, was the Willow reboot TV series.
Oh, yes.
Were you the one who watched that? I understand there was one viewer. So.
Yeah, we both did. We're the two viewers. Yeah.
Couldn't get past the first episode. In fact, I don't think we even finished the first episode. I think it was.
I watched the whole thing. My partner is a big fan of Willow, so I was basically forced to watch it.
Well, Lara is as well, but even she said no. That's
well, we kept doing that thing. Let's just give it another half an hour, see if it gets any better. Let's just give it another 10 minutes, and it didn't. Spoiler alert: it didn't get any better. But what took me out of it the most, apart from the god awful acting, a lot of it was the dialogue, because the young adult leads were all talking like California mall girls, like, "Hey guys, let's go check it out." It's just, what are you talking about?
Doesn't fit.
It was so jarring. It was really strange.
Well, this is a problem, and again, I have this discussion with my students, because I say, okay, what if you want to write a character who's not you? Because this is a huge challenge, right? I love alternative history fiction. Harry Turtledove probably is the king of alternative history his book, Guns of the South, I would say is the #1 alternative history book I've ever read. And it's set in Civil War era, mostly the Confederacy in the Civil War. It's a difficult read because people talk like they lived in the Confederacy during the Civil War. And to me, there's no way to avoid that.
No.
You can't just insert a 21st century Los Angeles dialogue. But I think the decision of a lot of creators today is to, I guess, make it accessible. Certainly don't insult anybody or don't make anybody uncomfortable. And I feel it's disastrous.
Yeah.
And Willow was a very good example of just, it's a bad choice. I also think the biggest problem is British actors. Let's talk about British actors here, because I grew up, my parents were both professors, and they watched Masterpiece Theater with Alistair Cook introducing. Now, you two are both at the level of Alistair Cook in terms of your presentation skills. I want to say that, and your Oxbridge accent, so definitely. But for those of you not enlightened on this, he was this just great, erudite, educated man, and he would introduce To Serve Them All My Days and I, Claudius, and this golden era of Masterpiece Theater where they had these amazing British dramas. And it was my introduction, because the two shows that I watched that were British at that time were Masterpiece Theater and Doctor Who. And so I would watch Masterpiece Theater, and somebody would be playing a Roman senator and giving a great speech. And then a week later, they would be an 8-foot cockroach on Doctor Who.
Yes.
But they would do a fantastic job. And I learned about the British regional theater system and how you played 100 plays, and some were comedies, and you were played young men and old men and women. And so the British actors come over here, and they still do that. They're still so impressive. And so when you have a mixed a company of like a British actor with 20 years experience, and then you cast an American ingenue 23-year-old with them, sorry, it's Bambi versus Godzilla. It just doesn't work.
Yeah.
Guess what film title I'm going to say for that?
Go on.
Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Oh my God.
Yes, absolutely.
I know where the bastard sleeps.
Yeah. Whoa. It was when he's going on the mountain and the blue fire, and he went, whoa. It was just like, oh dear.
And don't get me wrong, I love Keanu. He seems like a really great guy, and I love a lot of his films. But in that particular case, I think that's a prime example of what David mentioned there.
Absolutely.
You know, the television show, one of my favorites here, The Wire, which was on HBO, and it was this gritty, bleak drama about the drug trade and crime in Baltimore. And famously, several of the principal actors were British actors who I didn't find out about until after the show was over. They were British actors because they did their accents so perfectly. And in fact, you could look this up, but there's a hilarious comedy sketch on the Key and Peele show where they're on the set of a drama set in an inner city community in the United States, and this British actor does this great job, and like the American actors are being resentful that this British guy is coming in pretending to be a street American there. So this is a serious issue in the world of fantasy and science fiction. And I feel we should either have all British productions or all California productions. And we can't let these people mix.
Well, one other quick mention before we move back into the story would be Mary Poppins, of course, and Mr. Van Dyke's Cockney accent, but perhaps we'll draw a discreet veil over that in the interest of Anglo-American relations, I think. Yeah.
I just want to quickly mention what you were saying about the editorial thing, and because by all accounts, Lasser is one of the more hands-on of the editors of the time, so it is very possible. We don't know because, like I say, all his correspondence with Smith is sadly lost, but it is possible he did jump in. Now, it is actually something that I have had a row with an editor about, is that dialogue for period, because I tend to do quite a lot of stuff set in Victorian London. specifically London Bobbies and, Cockney Barra Boys and all this kind of stuff, right? And I've had them changing the dialogue, and I was just like, no. You don't. A London Bobby in 1888 would not say anything remotely like that. It was somebody wanting to change arse to ass, which when I threw my toys out the pram, I was just like, you said ass to a London Bobby, I'm going to kick your ass. It'd be like, what's my donkey done to you? It's an arse.
Yeah. I just think it's interesting that the arse was the hill you decided to make a stand on. You made a stand on the arse hill.
It is.
That's so Tim. That's very Tim.
That is so me, isn't it? Yeah, the hill I chose to die on was arse. Oh, dearie me.
I just want to make a quick mention about Mercury as well, the setting for this, because of course a lot of other Smith science fiction stories have been set on Venus. It's this very lush tropical Venus. So Mercury is a bit of a change, and he brings this interesting contrast into it, where one side is towards the sun and one is away from it. And I'm not sure what the astronomical knowledge of Mercury was at the time, but he wasn't far off. Because Mercury obviously is very close to the sun. It's the closest to the sun. It's about a third the size of the Earth. But a day there is 176 days. So for 88 days, one side is in sun, and then for the other 88 days, it's away from the sun, which means that the temperature, the surface temperature on Mercury, ranges from minus 170 degrees centigrade to 420 degrees centigrade, right, which is quite a range, isn't it?
Isn't it? Ah.
So he does capture that, doesn't he, in the story?
I think that was the original concept, that Mercury was locked in its orbit and there was always one side. I mean, he was following the science of the day. I mean, we say that he wasn't very sciencey, but he wasn't like creating a completely fabulous Mercury. In fact, the idea, I've read science fiction stories, I think up into the 50s and 60s, where you had Mercury was locked. And so you'd have the hot side and the cold side, and there would be a twilight zone, as he describes, in between, where there was the possibility of life. So he was fine for the science of the day, and other people have written those stories long after he did.
Yeah, and I'm sure HPL would have picked him up on any inaccuracies at the time as well. That's the sort he did. He was belaboring someone for getting the Martian day wrong by a couple of hours, wasn't he? Was it Burroughs? I think
he was.
Yeah. The Martian day should be 28 hours, not 26 or something. So let's talk about the Immortals then on this planet, because our hero, our protagonist, Mr. Howard, has suffered some sort of accident or misadventure, and basically wakes up, he's not sure where he is, and he ends up, as the protagonists in these stories tend to do, being taken captive by the locals, who in this case are the titular Immortals.
Yeah, before that, he's beleaguered by the sort of another race that dwell in the Twilight Zone, called the Delucus.
Oh, the
Delucus.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Who? Because he like I said, he was a botanist, so he was examining a queer, unfamiliar growth resembling a large truffle, which he had found in an open space among the pale, poddy, wind-bowed shrubs. Isn't that nice? The growth, when he touched it, had displayed signs of sluggish animation and had started to conceal itself, burrowing into the boggy soil. And yeah, so he was basically prodding this thing, like Mr. Hurt in the Alien film, as David mentioned, when he was surrounded by the Delucus, and they stolen upon him noiselessly from the semi-fungoid thickets. But he was not alarmed at first, thinking maybe they'd begun to overcome their shyness and show their barbaric curiosity. But no, they basically attacked him with rocks, didn't they?
Yes, and it is rescued, in effect, isn't he, by the Umnis, the Immortals.
Indeed, yeah.
Take him into the interior of Mercury. Again, that gives me a bit of a Star Trek vibe. There's a few episodes where they're inside a planet and people don't even know, kind of thing.
I wanted to add also, there is an episode of Stargate, the television show, where the adventurers in Stargate enter a cavern, and a genie-like creature, all alabaster white and giant, rises to talk to them. So it is really interesting when you see an idea and you wonder, like, was Smith the first person to come up with this description? And then I don't know whether the writers of Stargate or Star Trek or Alien read Clark Ashton Smith, but you got to give him credit for something being within the culture.
Yes. Sure. One thing I did notice about this story is that it's a setup Smith has done a few times now. In fact, it was very similar setup to the previous story we looked at. But what has happened in a few of these stories is scientist person in an unknown area gets sort of attacked by some kind of local thing, whether it be a creature or a race, and then rescued in inverted commas by a sort of higher being. But then, because, you know about us, we can't let you go. So you're going to have to stay with us forever. But this time, as we'll get to, slightly different. But it is a setup that Smith has done a few times. And it's a setup that you see over and over again throughout science fiction. It is sort of the classic sci-fi adventure setup, isn't it? So it is very similar to like Star Trek. It's usually a crash landing, isn't it? On like Star Trek or Doctor Who or Stargate SG-1 or any of these shows, right? Yeah, so I'd love to know who did it first.
They're basically escape rooms, aren't they, really, when you think about it?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
And I like this because this is a little bit different from those other stories we've mentioned. They've got this substance called mufa, which they use for lining the caverns. They use it for clothing. It protects them from the harmful rays of the sun, basically. But in order to make this mufa, they need protoplasm, as they put it.
Yeah.
And the way they get this protoplasm normally is from the criminals in their society, but it seems that there's very few criminals, very few of these immortals break the laws. So they say this to Howard: after studying you closely in his televisic mirror, Unavadu has decided that you are sufficiently high in the evolutionary scale to provide the protoplasmic elements in the next lot of Mufa. At least he thinks that the test is worth trying in the interests of science.
Yeah, I liked that little side.
The scientist becomes the experiment.
Yeah.
You know?
I thought it was interesting there as well that you get this little bit of hint of this is not a utopia. This is sort of a dystopia. I mean, first of all, there's very few of them, and you sort of wonder, like, okay, I guess you have, there's no children. There's no mention of that, right? They're sort of frozen as a society. They've had the same leader for a long time. It's not clear whether this is the shoal. The shoal is a title. It was a person. Now it's a title, like Caesar or something like that. And then this one has been around, and it's it's society where even if you break the slightest cultural conventions, you might be on the list to be melted down.
Yeah.
To make Mufa. It's a Hyperborean hell, absolutely, in terms of society. I wouldn't want to live among the immortals. In fact, you could actually wonder whether the title, the Immortals, it's a death sentence. It's a sentence to horror, not necessarily something wonderful to be immortal on Mercury.
I think in that sense, you're right. This does have the ring of a sort of Hyperborea story than a science fiction story.
It does, yeah.
I think, as David said, you could put it in that setting, change one or two things slightly, but the general outline of it would fit very well. The immortals will be necromancers, perhaps,
Indeed, yeah. And it'll be some earth metal that they can fortify with the bubbling protoplasm of wayward souls or something kind of like that kind of thing. Yeah, it is a very, but again, it's that very Smithian thing of a society that you get the impression is a society in decline don't you?
Yeah.
That they've sort of risen as high as they can, and now it's the inevitable fall.
Yeah.
Well, the fall is being put off. I mean, they're in a state of permanent decadence. I mean, you do imagine that eventually, again, there's no notation that like, and, children are exempt or something like that. So they may have a couple of hundred and they're immortal, but they have to kill one every X years. And so you can see their doom. In fact, you think of all those science fiction movies where the explorers go to Venus or Mars and they find a dead society that, had its glory, its apex, and then died out slowly. That's a very common trope now. I can think of a lot of old science fiction movies and stories with that. But you get the hint that the immortals are not going to last forever, even though that seems a contradiction.
Yeah.
That's true, but it also plays back to me to that old trope of every 5 years we have to sacrifice someone to the dragon. Right?
Indeed. Yeah. I like also at this sort of bit when they've been talking about this, because you get, just flashing back briefly to when he was rescued by them, the casual explanation of what that other race were going to do to him. You said that basically they'd strapped him to the back of a heat lizard. Now, this lizard likes to roam around in the hot, sunny side of Mercury and then go back to the Twilight Zone with basically a cooked person on their back, whereas with a cooked meal. So basically, flash frying the poor bugger, right? But I love how casual it is. So horror is sort of like it's nothing to these people, is it? Boiling people down into metal.
Yeah.
They were just going to turn you into a steak. It's fine, it happens.
Even if he is sufficiently high up on the evolutionary scale to be worth investigating.
Yes,
which is kind of quite eugenic in its outlook, isn't it? I guess.
Yeah.
I think a word I'd like to introduce as well here, if I could, is cruelty and amorality. A lot of the denizens of Smith's worlds, they're not immoral, they just don't have a morality that we can recognize. I mean, for example, a stranger comes into our midst, we will rescue them so that we can kill them horribly, but we will give them a draught that will make the pain less. So, I mean, they probably have some sort, their moral code is survival, I guess, but it's so interesting how there's not a deep exploration of this, but so many of the creatures that we meet, whether they're in Hyperborea or Venus or whatever, in Smith's worlds, have a system of ethics that is, I guess, just like the Cthulhu ethos. It's so far beyond our understanding that there's no point in trying to translate it to our understanding. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Well, it's like another well-worn sci-fi trope is the amoral scientist, isn't it? The scientist who will do anything to complete their investigations or make this breakthrough in science. But they're so amoral that they will do anything to do that. But they're not evil per se. It's just it doesn't even enter into their head that what they're doing is wrong, because in their heads, what they're doing is what they should be doing.
It's the pursuit of knowledge at all costs again.
Indeed, yeah.
But then it's interesting the way he gets chosen for this, because we have this sort of plant creature which almost sounds like they're worshipping it in some way, the rockalim, which we get a nice description of. And it's the rockalim that chooses the victim for this procedure, seemingly randomly, yet as it turns out, this is all a fix and is been set up to be chosen. So there's no doubt as to the outcome. So in that sense, that's, I think, like you said, Tim, the guy is going to make sure, the scientist is making sure that he gets the right result, right?
Oh, yeah. Rigging the deck. He's done what needs to be done so he can do his experiment, basically. Because think about it from his point of view. If he's proven that you can use a higher life form, such as this spacefaring chap, then one of his immortal mates doesn't have to be melted down, right? so that'll better his society.
Well, yeah.
So he's not thinking of it in terms of the poor sod that's going to get broiled. He's thinking about it in terms of, oh, well, I could stop our numbers dwindling because we wouldn't have to melt ourselves down.
The needs of the many and all that.
Indeed, there you go, and all that. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I think also, Smith is writing. This is 1932, 33. This story, as I recall. Right. So, again, you're much more familiar with Smith's talking about himself and their awareness, but like things were going on in Europe, which were going to be leading to the mass murder of people as an expedient for people who thought themselves better and higher than others. And I don't know how much Smith was paying attention to that in 1930, but 1933 was a pretty important year for that.
Yeah. Well, yes.
Right. Yeah. So, and of course, the same thing was going on in a different way in the Soviet Union at the time. So this was the era of the mass murder of hundreds of thousands, millions of people in the name of either they're not in the Soviet Union. It was that they weren't loyal to the party. They were politically wrong, or in Nazi Germany, that plus race and ethnicity and so on. So Smith was a little bit prophetic there in this story about talking about these super beings who thought themselves above morality and they could just do whatever they wanted to propagate themselves, and it didn't matter who they hurt.
Yeah. And in their minds, in their worldview, they're doing this for the greater good.
For the greater good.
That's their twisted perspective kind of thing. Yeah. I just wanted to read out the description of this plant thing as well, because the language in this is fairly subdued for Smith, but there are occasional splashes of colour. Now for the first time, Howard saw the singular object which the Umnis were facing. Apparently it was some sort of rootless plant growth with a swollen yellowish bowl or body like that of a barrel cactus. From this body, tall as a man, leafless branches of vivid arsenic green, fringed with a white hispidity, trailed in limp, sinuous masses on the cavern floor. There's a hint of tentacles in there, I think.
Oh, indeed. But you actually get this further on. There's a bit of a bit more to it here. Then, as he went on, he perceived with startled horror that the trailing tentacular boughs had begun to twitch and quiver and were lifting slowly from the floor and waving toward him. On and on they came, rising and straightening like a mass of ropey kelp that flows in an ocean stream. They reached him. They slithered with reptilian ease about his body and touched his face with their venomous-looking tips, clammy and inquisitive.
Ooh,
now that
nice.
is a great description, isn't it? That's almost Lovecraftian. That description. That is something you could see Lovecraft writing.
That is. I was thinking Ropey Kelp sounds like a sort of actor's name as well. You may remember me from such films as it came from the depths.
Well, I was reminded of Poddy Franz earlier because so
good old
Poddy Franz and Ropey Kelp. There you go.
He was just a master of using words so precisely and so beautifully and putting you in a situation where without visual illustration, you got a visual. You could see what he was talking about. I mean, you could imagine it, but you could also see it. And there are some writers who are great visual writers. They can describe something, but they don't leave anything to the imagination. And there are some people who are imaginative writers. But I think Smith was just able to merge the two and leave something to your imagination, but also describe something in just a beautiful light.
Yeah, so something I've always said about Smith's writing, it's no exaggeration to say, for me, that Smith gets more of a reaction out of me in terms of his language than any other writer. Because when I read things like that, I sort of have a bit of a shiver and go, bleh, because he's very good at getting that sort of reaction out of you. Whereas other writers will go more descriptive, and even to the point of like blood and guts and all the rest of it. He doesn't need to do that. He gets the shivers because of his use of language. It leaves enough to your imagination that your imagination runs riot.
And in terms of teaching writing, which I'm sure you do because you're both editors as well as writers, but one of the things that's very difficult when you're teaching writing is to get students to be detailed. Mm. Like somebody will say, this was a horrifying situation. And I'll ask, like, what was horrifying about it? In fact, you don't need to use the word horrifying. Just describe something which you and the reader would agree is horrifying. And we live in a society where close, careful, thoughtful observation is almost antithetical to our way of living, our way of describing things. And so Smith is just a master of describing things he's never seen. I mean, maybe he saw it in a dream, but how many people are good at describing their dreams? I've had very vivid dreams, and I've gotten up and I've told my wife I had just had a vivid dream, and she said, "Well, what?" She would say, "What did you dream about?" And I said, "Flower and Sean Connery." I mean.
All I'm saying to you, Rob, is 10,000 horses. That's his famous dream.
Yeah. There's been two. There was that one because I keep a notebook by the bed, and I woke up in the morning and read something I'd written, said 10,000 horses. Absolutely no memory of what it was. But the other one did end up as the story Corridors in the Corridors collection, which, funnily enough, was a subterranean setting as well. So, and I can still picture that dream. That was very strange. Something was breaking through at that point, but. Yeah, interesting. But I think it's Smith is cinematic in that sense. Yeah. And we've speculated before about we're just in the sort of early-ish years of the film industry, but everything is still black and white. So we wondered if prose pre-color film tended to be more colorful because people hadn't yet had that experience of seeing fantastic things like whether it's Ray Harryhausen monsters or what we see now.
Yeah,
you take it for granted that if you go and see an alien film, you're going to see a 15-foot tall being moving about. There's no strings, there's no wires. It looks real. Perhaps in that sense we become a bit jaded with all this.
Yeah, no, I think you're definitely onto something there because you see that now with modern writing. The amount of times I've had editors or publishers like saying, "Oh, you're too purple," or "There's too much description. There's too much this, that, and the other." They tend to go for that. It's almost like how I would liken it is MTV editing. It's fast cuts. It's like modern film. It's very much bang, 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 bang. There's no time for anything to breathe.
Yeah.
But I'm still drawn to. It's like the horror movies because I watch loads of horror movies, but modern ones. I watch them and then I forget about them because aside from a few jump scares, that's all there is. Whereas things like Don't Look Now, that's just an exercise in atmosphere all the way through. And that sticks with me much more. And it's the same with the writing. I read stuff that is more slow burn and it's much more memorable for me than something that is like from the sort of extreme horror end of it. It's just blood, guts, death, gore, done. It's MTV editing. It's bang, bang, bang.
And it's also so literal. I've been fascinated, and actually I'm working on a project for a class that I may or may not decide if it's good enough to put up on YouTube or something, about the question of trusting the audience versus not trusting the audience, or taking an unconventional step versus a conventional step. And I saw this most recently. I was watching A Quiet Place Day One. Right, it's the third movie in I don't know if you've seen it, but in the Quiet Place trilogy, and they make some unconventional choices and they make some conventional choices. But the ending is problematic for me because first they had a choice of 3 endings and they decided to do all 3, which is. Always, as an editor, you tell your writers, this is not a good ending, or this is a good ending, or here's another ending. But sometimes you go like, hey, you've got to end it you can't have all three great endings at the same time. So anyway, they pick all three endings, and then they undercut each ending. I'm not going to say any details, but then at the very last shot of the film, they don't trust the audience, because for 2 films and 99% of another film, we've been told that these monsters attack anything that's emitting a sound, any creature, right? So like you can't, that's the whole conceit, is like you have to be silent, right? And at the end of the film, a character makes a sound. I mean, I won't tell why they're making the sound or whether it's willing or not.
Right. Yeah.
And we're not idiots. We've been watching all these films. We know what's going to happen,
Yes.
but yet they have the monster appear, thump right there on the screen. And I just emitted a groan of saying, you don't have to show what happens next. And nowadays, the horror gets me. Like I was watching a television show, which was a horror show. I gave up because they did this. They would show a dead body. And okay, I understand it's modern television. You're going to show a grisly corpse, do it. But then they cut back to the dead body 4 times.
Yeah.
Why?
I've seen that in like detective TV shows, like modern stuff. It's like,
Yes,
there's a body on the
absolutely.
slab. We know it's on the slab. You don't have to keep showing us the body on the slab.
It adds nothing. It adds nothing except prurience to go back and show it again. I'm not a cranky old man. I am old, but I'm not as cranky as I sound right now. But like I don't show something that you don't have to show. Don't say something you don't have to say, or say it the one time and then trust the audience will remember it, and doesn't need to be ground in our face.
It desensitizes again, right? Which goes against the whole grain of trying to write something weird or horror or whatever it is. If anything, you want to make the audience more sensitive, I would have thought, not less.
Yeah.
So our protagonist ends up basically is going to be put on it sounds like a sort of slab or lab table, which is going to be tipped and is going to be dropped into this, what sounds like a sort of furnace, a sort of pool of molten liquid.
That's how I'm seeing it. Like yeah.
As part of this process. But then this is where the action kicks in, right? Because up to now, he's been biding his time. He's been going along with all this. They've taken his gun, obviously. In fact, I think he's naked at one point.
He is. Yeah.
So he's got no chance of concealing any weapon. He bides his time. And when the moment comes, he strikes.
Well, they ask him if he wants basically a narcotic, isn't it? It's just like,
yes,
we've got something that can. So he sort of uses that which I thought was a great sort of escape thing. Oh, yeah. He's sort of feigning defeat, isn't he, at this point?
Yeah.
He's like, yeah, bring me the drugs. I'll take the drugs and I'll go with it.
And we should also mention as well, a bit like in the last story, in the course of taking him to this place, his captor Agver has pointed out, oh yeah, there's our central control room.
Yes.
Basically, if anyone hits that button, it shuts everything down.
Yeah.
Now, anyway, so we do have that little thing again, which I thought was funny.
Yeah.
But yeah, he seizes his chance and basically he picks Agver up bodily and throws him into the furnace, which was, I wouldn't say Smith is not a non-violent writer, but we don't get a lot of violence in that sense, do we?
No.
That's quite grim, I think.
I'm getting the ending of Terminator 2 from this scene.
Yeah.
You know, the fight in the foundry with the T-1000 going into the molten metal and all that. So that's kind of how I'm seeing it in my head.
Well, we've got Gollum in Mount Doom as well.
Yeah,
of course.
Mount Doom. Yeah, of course.
I mean, it really would be just fascinating to go back and say, who was the first person who had a villain or somebody thrown into a volcano or melting in a volcano? I mean, there must have been some first in literature there. Of course, as you have pointed out, there were so many pulp stories circulating that probably we could never nail that down. But It's a fantastic image, right? The idea of being thrown into a vat of horrible thing.
Oh yeah.
I just thought of Darth Vader as well, actually. Come to think of it.
Yeah.
That's the volcano, isn't it?
Indeed. Yeah. Well, it goes back to the old medieval punishment of boiling in oil as well, I suppose,
There's got to be something in sort of Parsifal or something like that, is there? Or some of the old Norse myths, perhaps there's got to be a volcano in there somewhere. Perhaps a more knowledgeable listener can let us know on that.
Indeed. Yeah.
So that sets off the last sort of, the rest of the story, which is this long chase scene, which is full of action and violence. But it's interesting because it starts off quite fast-paced. Is being chased throughout this complex and is hitting the Immortals with an iron bar that is picked up. But then it sort of slows down because he finds himself lost in this labyrinth of caves where he starts meeting a number of strange underworld denizens and various types of fungi and that sort of thing. So I thought that was an interesting contrast between this high-speed chase and lots of fights, and then this really, what time-wise, it seems like almost days, is wandering through these caverns.
I have a question. I felt a lot of literature that I was reading from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, even up to today, you could explain some of the content by they were paid per word. I mean, let's face it, they needed money. And so if they could add another 1,000 words of description, maybe that was $50, right?
Yes.
Or something like that. But you're saying, please educate me, for Wonder Stories, Weird Tales, they were paid per story?
No, it depends. A lot of them were paid by the word. Like I say, that one of the reasons he wanted to go for Astounding Stories is that they had probably the best rate of pay of that time for the pulps, which was 2 cents a word. A lot of them were 1 cent a word, and then others would just pay like, okay, that's a 5,000 word story. We'll give you $50.
Yeah,
kind of thing. I guess that's kind of it. But by all accounts, one of the best paying was Astounding Stories for 2 cents a word. So yeah, in that situation we've discussed this before, haven't we? I would. I'll stick another 500 words in there.
I'm going to come to that in the letters as well, because there's something about payment in one of Smith's letters, which we'll get to, a nice little point. I thought this sort of long underground scene in the caverns was quite grim as well, because he discovers these sort of rat-like creatures and he ends up smashing one to a pulp in order to eat it. He takes a drink from a very dodgy sounding pool that sort of knocks him out and makes him feel really poorly. And he ends up even eating worm-type creatures.
Yeah.
Oh, and has a fight with a giant slug as well, which was quite interesting.
Yeah, I liked that bit. That was probably my favourite bit in the whole story, was actually that sequence in that underground lightless depths with all these weird and wonderful creatures. It's a lot of fungoid matter, isn't there? Like lots of wiggling fungus and things. It's great.
It's Dungeons and Dragons, isn't it? Basically,
yeah.
That's your proto Dungeons and Dragons cavern adventure. And I thought maybe that slug creature was a kind of foreshadowing of the Charnel god as well, which obviously we'll get to in due course.
This comes up. I don't play RPG historically. I haven't. I did play some science fiction ones when I was younger. Traveler was a system for science, and then Larry Niven's famous novel Ringworld, which I guess was the biggest science fiction novel of its time, had a role-playing game which was really very good, and I actually ran a couple of campaigns. This is a long time ago, but I've never played any of the Cthulhu or just a little bit of Dungeons and Dragons because somebody in my family wanted to play, and I was fine doing that. But you do come across this with Smith's writing, is that it reads like today you could say it was a great write-up of our campaign, right?
Yeah.
Even the Averoigne stuff, right? It doesn't have to be the quote fantasy stuff as such. Even Averoigne, you could see as D&D really, or any of the other major sort of games.
Well, again, that's something we've discussed before, haven't we? It's like a lot of these pulp writers, a lot of it, you can tell that these scenarios have been based on their writing. I think August Derleth is a great example.
Yes.
Because a lot of his stories read like a Call of Cthulhu campaign.
Yeah.
And that's not a bad thing in my mind. It's just that a lot of these people have come across before because I guess it's got simpler systems to a lot of the more out there stuff, right? There's a protagonist, there's an antagonist, there's a thing. Go for it. So a lot of his stuff, to my mind, does read like that.
Brian Lumley as well, I would say.
Brian Lumley, yes, is another one. Yes.
And I guess this is also a question for you, that does it work both ways? Because famously, and please correct me if you think I'm wrong on this, there's really never been a great movie that originated as a video game. I mean, maybe those exceptions I'm sure you'll point out, but famously, video games don't seem to translate into great movies, either at the box office or like aesthetically, artistically, narratively. But you can have a great book that becomes a video game.
Yes, agreed. Yeah, I'd actually agree with you. There are very few video game adaptations that aren't utter crap, to be honest. But there is some, but they're generally ones that fly completely under the radar because they're very obscure games. And they're even more obscure films. Like an example is the game Detention, which was a superb survival horror game from Taiwan. And there's two adaptations, actually. There's a Netflix series, but there's a film which is incredibly faithful. And I thought they did a tremendous job with it. But it's such a simple premise. It's basically two people stuck in a school and there's weird stuff going on. So, but what the problem is, what a lot of these people do is, how do you translate something like Borderlands, for example, right? How do you translate that into a movie when it's basically just people running around blowing crap up?
Which is the general thing with weird fiction, isn't it, in terms of adaptation? Even how do you translate atmosphere into... Yeah.
How would you realize a Shoggoth? There you go.
Well, even if you take M.R. James, right, and those adaptations, and there's some have been more successful than others, and they're always nice to watch regardless of that. But, well, the prime example is the Mezzotint, right, where we come back to that. You didn't need to show the thing at the end in all that detail. Now, this thing that was creeping across the lawn, and now it's a guy in a mask, you know?
Yeah. They did not. They just, all they needed to show was the open window and
just a hand,
a shadow, or a hand or something. They didn't need to show it coming in the window. Again, like David was saying earlier, that got a groan out of me for the showing of the monster.
Yeah,
she didn't need to do that. Yeah.
So let's cut through to the ending then, because after all of these endeavors, our protagonist eventually escapes. He gets back into the alien complex. And finally, after what seems like days and hours of sort of roaming around this place, he sees daylight, he feels cool air, and he sort of pops out back on the surface. I have to say, this ending really caught me out. I wasn't expecting this. So I'm just going to read the last paragraph.
I just want to quickly ask something before you do that, because there's a whole bit where as he's leaving the subterranean castles, the subterranean caverns, that there's some guards and they're closing this almost like an airlock, right? He has a bit of a scuffle and he slides under the door just as it slams down on his suit of armor thing that he's wearing, right? But he wriggles free of it. Now, does this mean that for these final moments of this story, our unlucky protagonist is stark bollock naked on Mercury?
Oh dear!
Because he was naked earlier, wasn't he? He was stripped naked.
He was. Is that part of Smith being saucy again, though? Because he does like to throw in a little bit of sauce, even in a grim story like this.
He does. He does.
Well, he he had a health potion and rolled 2d6.
Nice.
Which, by the way, going back to the video game problem, that's one of them, right? Is like we will accept playing. One of my family plays Skyrim. We'll accept somebody playing Skyrim is fighting a dragon beast, and then takes the health potion and wears the health cloak, and they're restored. But if we saw that in a movie, boy, that would just slow. It's too literal. It would just slow down. It would be silly, and then of course people would say like, well, what's the point of watching him fight if he's just going to be, reboosted with a potion?
Yeah.
Well, take our early example, right? If you put that in D&D terms, our immortal gets tipped into the fiery furnace and loses 100 hit points, right? So if the human goes in, the human's got 50 hit points, is toast. If the guy's got 130 hit points, he survives it. He can climb back out. That's one of the vagaries of the D&D system, which, as you say, if you translate that into film, it just looks ridiculous.
Well, also when you look at it, because a lot of these adaptations have been of horror games, like the Resident Evils, your Silent Hills, all that kind of stuff, right? And one of the big things of those games is the puzzle element, right? You've got these almost incomprehensible puzzles where you could, like, Raccoon City Police Department has doors that you can only open by putting 4 crests in, and those crests are hidden around the police station in other puzzles, right? How the hell are you supposed to do that in a film without somebody going, well, who fitted that lock? Isn't that stupid?
Yeah, let's just kick it in.
Let's just kick it in, Especially as they're all armed to the teeth, right? Why can't you just blow the door? Why can't you just blow the bloody doors off?
Blow the bloody doors off.
I think side quests are also very difficult in film. Yeah. Like you wander into a village and a farmer says, "Hi, stranger. Perhaps you've heard that the daughter of the mayor has been kidnapped by a dragon, and he's giving 100 ducats gold to whoever can rescue her and information about where to find the wizard." And I mean, I think that actually was one of the problems that some of these adaptations were mentioning lately of the big screen, several $100 million adaptations. I won't comment on Rings of Power. I don't want to get in trouble with what I would say, but that really is, again, going back to Ashton Smith, I just feel like he often makes really good choices that even within the genre conventions and limitations of the time, I like it when the protagonist has gone through all of this struggle and it was for naught.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm dark person, but I don't like it when there's a pat ending. And then he escaped and his crewmates were waiting for him and applied salves and he was okay.
Yeah, I'm exactly the same. Yeah.
Which is not unusual for Smith generally, but I don't know, for some reason, I think perhaps it was because of the length of the chase and the escape and all that. I thought the ending, it did catch me by surprise a bit.
I really liked it, yeah.
I just want to say one other thing as well. The sliding under the closing door bit you mentioned there, Tim. There were 2 things with that. First, I thought Captain Kirk combat role, right? That's got to be.
Indeed, yeah.
And then I thought that was an interesting thing because when he goes through, it's the heel of his suit that gets caught because the aliens have strange, obviously different shaped feet. So he's got these heel bits flapping behind. It's the heel that gets caught. And you said at the start something about his mother was ill with an infected heel.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. While he was writing it.
Yeah. Odd little thing.
I hadn't picked up on that. Yeah, but I did pick up on was Smith's description of this all the way through, which kept making me chuckle because I'm a child. Horny heels. So I'm thinking about stilettos, right? Horny heels.
Well, I'm actually wearing stilettos at the moment, but the listeners don't need to know that.
I was wondering whether you obviously with literary references, you can just go nuts and seeing things that aren't there, but Achilles.
Oh,
indeed, yeah.
And his mother.
Yes.
Dipping him. And he's immortal except for his heel.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, I mean, I have to think that was a little bit in CAS's thoughts there.
Yes.
You do get quite a lot of references to like Greek and Roman mythology in his stories. So yeah, I would say yeah.
Well, we are on Mercury as well. Mercury, of course.
Yeah.
Well, the Greeks called Mercury Hermes, right? They called the planet Hermes as well. So, yes. Funnily enough, the Babylonians called it Nabu, which means messenger as well. So they had the same name for it, but,
Yeah.
even earlier.
Naboo, is that Star Wars?
No, Nabu was in the Mighty Boosh, wasn't
Oh,
he?
that's it. Yeah.
It's the shaman.
I thought Naboo was a planet in Star Wars as well.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, well,
It is
right. I'm right on
where
it. Yeah.
There you go.
The Jar Jar Binks.
That's it. Yeah.
Yes, the most famous and respected character in the Star Wars pantheon, who now looks like a genius move, compared to what they've done lately.
I'm waiting for a Disney spin-off. I'm waiting for the Disney Jar Jar movie. It's gonna happen one of these days.
The Jar Jar prequel is coming out. It's $400 million. So I'm the science advisor.
You are joking, right?
Would I really joke about that?
Oh, that'd be brilliant. I'd watch it just for the just for the hell of it.
Okay, so the last paragraph then. It was not the familiar twilight zone of Mercury in which he had come forth. It was the bleak nightward side, eternally averted from the sun and blasted with the frightful cold of cosmic space. He felt the pinnacles and chasms close him in, relentless and rigid like some Hyperborean hell. Then the realization of his plight became something very remote and recessive, a dim thought that floated above his ebbing consciousness. He fell forward on the snow, with limbs already stiff and unbending, and the mercy of the final numbness grew complete.
Nice. Yeah. It has almost got the ending of one of his Conte Cruels, hasn't it? It's got that kind of... yeah, that grimness to it. I'd love to know what the original ending was, because apparently that was added before he sent it to Farnsworth Wright. But unfortunately, the original versions don't exist anymore, which is a real shame.
Yeah, because he does mention that in the letters as well about adding in. I think Lovecraft mentions it. Oh, he thinks the grim ending really works.
Yeah, because he says to Derleth, I'm changing, I'm making it grim, and then Wright might like it. So yeah, it'd be interesting to know what the original ending was. Maybe because they do mention earlier on, as he's being taken to the place with the molten metal, and he shows them the control room. But he also says, yes, and that path up there is where goes to where your spaceship is.
Yeah, I really struck me here that this is a really good twist ending, because everything is set up for heat. You're going to be boiled alive, you're going to be burned, you're going to be roasted. That's the threat, right? That he's suffering repeatedly. People are the creatures of the planet, and then he dies because of cold. I'm actually reminded of an episode of the original Twilight Zone where a character is living in this apocalyptic world where the sun I don't know what the scientific explanation was, but like the sun has increased its output and is boiling the earth. And then at the very end of the episode, you find out that the character was dreaming, and actually the reverse is happening. The earth is going into an ice age, and they're all going to freeze.
Oh, I do remember that one. Yeah.
So I like that twist where for the entire story, you're going like, boy, the big threat is him being burned or roasted or heated. And then, oh my gosh, poor guy, he dies of freezing.
It is. It's a nice little inversion of expectations, I think. Yeah. So I just want to finish with a couple of extracts from the letters from Dawnward Spire and Lonely Hill. There's only a few very brief mentions, but this one actually takes up that point we were just talking about. And it's got, of course, a marvellous return address, which is reason enough to read this extract. So this is from HPL to Smith, 26th of February 1932, and the return address is: in the orange, carmine and blue litten zone at the end of the angles, beyond the vague twilight abysses, hour of the sounding of the gong, at the bottom of the unplumbed pit. Dear Clark Ashton.
I always love that. It's the jump from baroque to mundane. I love it. It's absolutely brilliant.
Your new ending for the Immortals seems to promise splendidly. I recall that you regarded this tale rather lightly before. Perhaps for once, commercial pressure may have an effect other than deleterious, leading you into some potent realism which you would not otherwise have introduced. So there's an interesting take from Mr. Lovecraft on editing. That certainly makes a change for HPL.
Yeah, he's right. He's not wrong though, because I mean, I've had it when you work with a good editor, it can really elevate the story, because they'll say, "Well, have you thought about that?" And I hadn't, so I'll then go off and write another 2,000 words about something, that I wouldn't have thought about until they sort of pointed it out. So it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Sometimes, I think.
Absolutely.
I think that's something that's so important. I certainly bring this up in discussing students with their writing, is that the most blessed thing would be to find an editor who brings out your voice the best that it can be. I mean, you don't want an editor who changes everything about who you are, because then you're no longer a writer.
Yeah.
And you might as well just give them co-credit. But if you can find somebody who says, I know what you're trying to get at here, but you're not getting at it well enough, go back and keep trying to and find another way to say this, and respects you as a writer by making you a better writer. And that's a rare thing, that relationship. But it's very important for students and anyone who's beginning the world of writing to try to find that and to appreciate it when they see it.
Totally. Yes.
Yeah.
Now, we have a response from Smith. This is the 15th of April, 1932, and this is now alluding to payment, as we mentioned earlier. And Smith, of course, has his own return address. Crater of Tycho, at the hour of the nameless cosmic echo that returns annually.
Nice.
Dear H. Pyel, I'll get some copies of the Immortals of Mercury when it comes out and send you one. Gernsback certainly takes the cake for slowness in remitting, but he does publish promptly and doesn't keep accepted matter in the icebox for 18 months or 2 years. So with all his delays, I often get my money more quickly from him than from Wright. And as you suggest, he is a little more open and receptive in his policy than the other. So Hugo the Rat did have some redeeming features as well.
Oh yeah, he was just notoriously hard to get money out of. I mean, that's basically it. Apart from, it's like, from what I gather, all of these guys actually liked working with David Lasser, the editor for Gernsback, because I've never actually seen anybody moaning about him, whereas you see him moaning about Wright all the time, right?
And then finally, we've got one more mention from HPL. This is the 10th of July, 1932. Quite a short return address this time. Gulf of Blackness, Hour of the Knell. Dear Clark Ashton, I noted with pleasure your gargoyle story in the latest Weird Tales. Also, I found the Immortals of Mercury awaiting me when I reached home and read it with keen interest. It would have been much better, I fancy, if not deprived of the parts you mention, but even as it is, it furnishes more than one authentic shudder. It ought to have action enough to suit even the canny Gernsback, and, in addition, the later parts give a very real thrill of subterranean horror. Glad that Hugo and co didn't demand a happy ending. The present abrupt punch comes as a magnificently ironic touch. So that's what David pointed out, yeah, that irony of the guy faces being burnt alive all the time and eventually freezes to death.
Yeah. What I picked up on there was what we've been discussing about. I'd love to know how much was edited, because it sounds like, because obviously Lovecraft read the version of it before it had the shears. So it'd be really interesting to know. But unfortunately, I don't think any of those early versions exist, which is a real shame.
Yeah. Who knows where these things could have ended up or would have ended up.
Yeah.
Really, Smith is just endless, because you read a story, and I bought all 5 Nightshade editions at once. And again, I'd read a little bit of Smith, but then I said, okay, I'm going to finally do this deep dive. I'm at a point in my life where I have the ability to do that. And I bought them, and I realized you can't like try to read them in the night, right? You have to like read one, let it simmer.
This is what we had exactly the same conversation when we first started this podcast, didn't we?
It's like gourmet food, right? You don't just whack a load down.
Yeah. Smith is not fast food. It's not gruel. And I think that allows you to appreciate each gemstone, which I think these stories are, in its own right, and to see the differences and to see the decisions he made. And again, I just recommend Smith, not just to read and appreciate Smith, but to learn from Smith about the choices that writers, artists make. And you can disagree with them, but there's no better tutor in the world of literature about the kind of choices because of the range of writings that he did.
I think it's something we've said as well, although our talents fall woefully short of Smithy or any of those people. I think he is a writer you can learn from for all those reasons you just pointed out.
Absolutely.
And it does annoy me when we see this idea that what people say about Lovecraft, it's unreadable, and Smith even more so. And I think, well, I mean, as we said before, you can have a dictionary to hand. You can look things up with the press of a button now. There's no real excuse for struggling with words.
Yeah, well, I've seen it. I've seen that said about people like Thomas Ligotti as well. But again, different eras. So, but it's the use of language. And that's one thing that Ligotti shares with Smith is that very dense language. Like you say, it's not an entree. It's the main course, right? You can't just whiz through Ligotti. You've got to savor it.
I'm actually working through Grimscribe at the moment because I managed to get a copy at the Atlantis bookshop, funnily enough.
Tremendous book.
It's claustrophobic is the word.
That's the word. Yeah. Have you had an existential crisis yet?
Oh, well, I've one of those every day at the moment. I think we're living in a time of existential crisis in general. But, that's another subject.
I want to mention one more thing. I'm sorry to drag on, but I'm just so excited. I'm really like the proverbial kid in the candy store to be able to have this conversation with you. Recently, I saw on Reddit, I think it was the fantasy or the science fiction Reddit or one of them, somebody made this really interesting comment about when you're an ordinary person living in an ordinary world and you may vaguely believe in some supernatural, but you just don't think it's going to happen to you. And suddenly you're confronted by actual supernatural where there's no other explanation, right? And how people react. And he was giving the example of the second Ghostbusters movie where there's a museum curator, an art curator, who is looking at this painting of this medieval warlord, and the medieval warlord, the woe of Croatia, the destroyer of Moldavia, whatever, comes to life. And other than that, yeah, that's right. Other than you're having a brain seizure of some kind, there's no possible materialistic explanation for this. And the figure comes to life and says, by the way, I'm going to conquer the world and you're going to be my servant in conquering the world. And the person who wrote this said, that's a very realistic reaction, that you wouldn't go like, no, I will stand up for humanity, or like, I don't understand. What do you mean? I think the average person would go, okay, yes, I am your servant, Lord.
Yeah, that's exactly what he does. It's brilliantly played, isn't it? He goes, okay, yes, okay, Vico, whatever you say, mate.
and I think Smith has that. Obviously, a lot. Unless I'm missing something, I certainly have missed something in my years that I've never had an encounter with, a resurrected medieval warlord sent by the devil or whatever. But I always have thought, I'm a scientist and I don't believe in anything that isn't proven by science or could be proven by science. But if I ever had an actual encounter, I probably would just go with it, and Smith tells us that. He puts us in these situations where we think like the Avignon story is a very good example, probably even more so than Immortals of Mercury, of like, what would you do in that situation? I enjoy that.
Yes, same.
It is a very good point, and I think if you go to the M.R. James perspective, there's usually that denial, right?
Indeed.
So it's an interesting that acceptance and denial. That's a very interesting subject. David, I think we need to get you back on sometime. Perhaps we'll get you on the Innsmouth Book Club as well. I feel there's so many things we can talk about that we've touched on today.
I would love it.
So there we go. That's the Immortals of Mercury. As always, dear listener, please do let us know what you think. I think we've got through without any major mispronunciations today, didn't we? Name-wise, this one was pretty straightforward.
Indeed, yeah.
Thank you so much. Really, that was just so. I learned so much, and I enjoyed the interaction. You're both so knowledgeable and reading the letters, and thank you, professors, for educating me.
We're street professors, as I said before. We're the other side of the tracks from Oxbridge, but as we always say, we're not scholars in any way, but we are very keen and enthusiastic fans, and it's great to have people such as yourself come on and share this wonderful sandbox, whether it's Lovecraftian mythos or Smith or whatever.
Indeed.
Yes.
So thank you very much for coming on, David, and we look forward to having you back very soon.
Thank you. I look forward to it.
So, Tim, what are we looking at next time? What's our next story?
Next time, we've got an absolute classic lined up. We're going to the Empire of the Necromancers. I know you've been looking forward to this one, haven't you?
Necromancers. Yeah, I should say in my 10mm fantasy campaign, my commander is a necromancer. It's an undead army I'm running. So,
oh, nice.
I do like a good necromancer story, and Smith does them best of all, doesn't he?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Great. Well, we're looking forward to that. As always, please do let us know any comments, questions, or suggestions. Drop us a post on our Facebook page or on the YouTube channel, or you can send us an email at innsmouthbookclub@outlook.com. And of course, you can also leave a post on our Patreon site, where, if you'd like to support the show, you can sign up as a patron. That will give you access to bonus content for Strange Shadows and the Innsmouth Book Club. It will give you free admission to events such as the Innsmouth Literary Festival, which is only a couple of weeks away now, and one or two other things as well. I'm working up some new T-shirt designs at the moment. I know this is something I say all the time, but at the ILF, I'm going to be unleashing a very nice new King in Yellow T-shirt design.
Ooh.
So I think he's going to knock your socks off.
So I'll be buying one of them then. You're just doing it to get money out of me again, aren't you? I'll be having one of them, and I want one of the Mego Stole My Brain as well, to make sure you got one of them in XL.
I thought you had one of those already.
No, not yet. No.
Right. I've got the I Heart Nyarlathotep as well, like the I Love NY one as well. That's looking good. Anyway, that's all to come. That's it from us today. Thanks again to David for being a wonderful guest. With that, it's goodbye from me, Rob Poynton.
And it's goodbye from me, Tim Mendes.